Good morning, philosophers. As many of you know, there's a lively debate, both within the academic field of bioethics, but also in our wider society, about whether it is ever permissible for doctors to help a patient to die. Such assistance can take the form either of so-called active euthanasia, where the doctor kills the patient to spare them from future pain and suffering, or physician-assisted suicide, where the doctor provides the patient with the means to kill herself, for example, by writing a prescription for a lethal dose of drugs. In many jurisdictions, helping a person die by suicide is a crime, and doctors who provide such assistance can be prosecuted for manslaughter or similar crimes. But at the same time, over the past decades, there's been a growing movement calling for the recognition of a so-called right to die and the legalization of physician-assisted suicide. Physician-assisted suicide is now permitted in a number of countries, under certain circumstances, of course, including Canada, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and parts of the United States. The paper we're reading today, David Velleman's A Right to Self-Termination, was originally written for an academic conference on the ethics of assisted suicide. Velleman, however, approaches this issue indirectly. Most of his article deals not with the ethics of physician-assisted suicide, but rather with the ethics of suicide itself, which does not involve the actions of a doctor or of any other third party. The central question of Velleman's paper is, can a person permissibly kill herself when going on living is no longer in her interests? Let's make this our first thinking exercise of the day. Why do you think does Velleman take this indirect approach? Why foreground the question of suicide, even if Velleman's aim is ultimately to reach a position on the ethics of assisted suicide? Take a minute to consider this question. All right, welcome back. So the question I left you with was, why, if Velleman's aim is to reach a position on the ethics of assisted suicide, does his paper deal primarily with the moral permissibility of killing oneself without the aid of others? I think the answer is something like this. Velleman considers that the question whether it is morally permissible for a person to kill herself is more fundamental than the question whether it is permissible for another person to do so at her behest. Specifically, Velleman reasons that if it is morally impermissible for a patient to take her own life, at least for certain reasons, then a fortiori it is morally impermissible for another person, for example a doctor, to help her in doing so. As Velleman writes on page 614, quote, encouraging others or assisting others in impermissible conduct is itself impermissible. So, take a look at the table to my left. The question that Velleman is asking is question 1. Is it permissible for a person to kill herself? And if yes, for what reasons? So Velleman's thought is that a negative answer to question 1 suggests a negative answer to question 3 as well. However, notice that the reverse implication does not necessarily hold. Suppose it were morally permissible for a person S to kill herself under circumstances C. It doesn't follow that it would therefore be permissible for another person, a doctor say, to help S kill herself under those same circumstances C. For example, suppose you think that it is morally permissible for a lovesick teenager to commit suicide. It doesn't follow at all that a doctor can permissibly help the teenager to commit suicide, for example, by prescribing her a lethal drug. We have to make a second important distinction. Now, Despite the somewhat misleading title of his article, Velleman's question is whether it is morally permissible to commit suicide, not whether one has a moral right against the state to commit suicide or assisted suicide. To say that someone has a moral right against the state to engage in conduct of a certain kind is to say that it would be morally impermissible for the state to coercively intervene to prevent or penalize this conduct. Velleman does not take a stand on these questions in his article. He's quite clear that even if suicide and assisted suicide were to be shown to be morally wrong, it doesn't follow that the state would be morally permitted to prevent people from killing themselves or even assisting others in doing so. So, in terms of our diagram, a negative answer to question 1 does not imply a negative answer to questions 2 and 4. As Velleman writes on page 614 of his article, the impermissibility of someone else's conduct doesn't necessarily give me, or the state, permission to interfere with it. Consider an example that has come up repeatedly in this course. Suppose we believe that it is wrong to cheat on your spouse. It doesn't follow that the state should make it illegal to commit adultery or to punish people for it, or indeed to make it illegal to help others to cheat, for example, by running a dating website for married people. We've discussed a number of possible reasons for why this should be so, ranging from a broad commitment to anti-paternalism in the vein of John Stuart Mill to more pragmatic arguments. For example, the powers that we would have to give over to the state to prevent this kind of wrongdoing would be overly invasive or ripe for abuse. All right. Let me tell you a little bit more about the intellectual context in which Velleman's article was written. Although Velleman's paper, as I've just said, addresses the question whether solo suicide is morally permissible, it was provoked in part by a document which addressed itself to the question whether individuals should have a right against the state to commit physician-assisted suicide. This was the so-called Philosopher's Brief, which was an amicus brief submitted to the United States Supreme Court in the case of Washington et al. V. Glucksberg in 1997. At the time, both Washington State and New York State had laws criminalizing assisted suicide. In particular, they prohibited doctors from prescribing lethal medications to patients who wanted to kill themselves. Now, in the Glucksberg case, a dying patient and his doctors challenged the constitutionality of these bans. 6 eminent moral and political philosophers, Ronald Dworkin, Thomas Nagel, Robert Nozick, John Rawls, Tim Scanlon, and Judith Thomson, a veritable who's who of contemporary moral philosophy, they submitted a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court urging the court to recognize a constitutionally protected right to assisted suicide and to invalidate the state bans on that basis. This was the so-called Philosopher's Brief. Now, as part of their argument, the authors asserted that every competent adult person has a broad moral permission, quote, to live and die in the right of his own convictions about why his life is valuable and where its value lies, end quote. I'll put a link to the Philosopher's Brief in the description of this video so that you can take a look at it for yourself if you're interested. Ultimately, however, despite this assembled philosophical firepower, the court declined to recognize a right to assisted suicide and upheld the state bans on physician-assisted suicide. Now, the Supreme Court judges weren't the only ones who were unpersuaded by the argument of the Philosopher's Brief. David Velleman, too, was provoked by it, to put it mildly. His article can be read as Velleman's attempt to get clear on what so disturbed him about the Philosopher's Brief. Velleman argues that the principle put forward in the Philosopher's Brief, that people have a moral permission to live and die in light of their own convictions about why their life is valuable and where its value lies, that this principle could be derived from two broader moral ideas. First, that a person is morally permitted to make his own life shorter in order to make it better. To make it shorter, that is, if doing so is a necessary means or consequence of making it a better life on the whole for him. Second, that there is a presumption in favor of deferring to a person's judgment on the subject of his own good. Now, as we will see, Velleman actually accepts the second principle, that there is a presumption in favor of deferring to a person's judgment on the subject of his own good. He will deny, however, that it is really relevant to the morality of suicide and physician-assisted suicide. We'll come back to these arguments in a little while. Velleman's main beef, however, is with the first principle, that a person is morally permitted to make his own life shorter in order to make it better. So, let's begin by trying to understand why Velleman rejects this idea. Now, one possible reason to reject such a broad moral permission to kill oneself when doing so is in one's own interest is that suicide often harms third parties, like family members or other dependents. However, Velleman quickly sets this objection aside, not because he doesn't think it's important in its own right, but rather because it tacitly concedes an assumption that Velleman wants to reject. Namely, that the only relevant considerations as far as suicide is concerned are considerations of human well-being. As Velleman writes, I want to set aside this question because it tacitly concedes the assumption that the values at stake in life or death decisions are relative to personal interests. It merely invites us to consider a wider circle of beneficiaries. The values that we need to consider, in my view, aren't relative to personal interests and consequently have no beneficiaries. So, if it's not harm to third parties, what then is Velleman's key objection to committing suicide in order to spare oneself from future pain? To understand Velleman's answer, we first have to pause and understand his distinctive views about the value of human well-being. As we learned earlier in this course, classical utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham believe that well-being is good or valuable in itself. Indeed, it is the only thing that is ultimately good in itself. That is why, according to utilitarians, we should always seek to bring about the state of affairs that contains the largest quantity of well-being in the aggregate. A common criticism of this utilitarian view of well-being, however, is that it fails to take people sufficiently seriously. In a sense, it is alleged, the utilitarian cares about people only because they are the receptacles for the thing that ultimately matters, namely happiness. The utilitarian, it might be said, wants people to be happy because what he ultimately values is happiness itself. But this, we might think, inverts what strikes most of us as the correct order of dependence. Human well-being matters because people matter, not vice versa. Now, whether or not this is ultimately a fair criticism of utilitarianism, it is important to understand that David Velleman's understanding of the value of human well-being is fundamentally different. Like Elizabeth Anderson, who for many years was Velleman's colleague at the University of Michigan, David Velleman is a Kantian moral philosopher. Both Velleman and Anderson subscribe to a distinctively Kantian view about the value of human well-being. According to this view, a person's well-being or good has only conditional value, which depends on the value of the person herself. As Velleman writes on page 611, what's good for a person is worth caring about only out of concern for the person, and hence only insofar as he is worth caring about. So, just as the value of a means is conditional on and relative to the value of the end for which it is a means, so too is the value of someone's life going well conditional on and relative to the value of the person whose life it is. Velleman illustrates this with the example of a severely depressed person. So imagine, he says, a depressed person who thinks wrongly that she's worthless, without value. Now, such a person will often stop caring about what happens to her. Because if she doesn't matter, then what does it matter what happens to her, whether her life is good or bad? Now, of course, Velleman thinks the depressed person is making a mistake in thinking that she's worthless. She does matter. Indeed, she matters in herself and unconditionally because she's a rational being. And rational beings, for Kantian, are ends in themselves that have unconditional value. Kantians have a technical term for this. They say that the value that a person has in herself, in virtue of her rational nature, is her dignity. So, for the Kantian, unlike the utilitarian, the importance of a person's well-being, or what is good for the person, is derivative of the person's unconditional value, her dignity. Her well-being matters just because she herself, as a rational being, matters unconditionally. This distinction between these two types of value, the value of a person's good or well-being on the one hand, and the value of her dignity, is absolutely key for Velleman's main argument. So let's dwell on it a little longer. Well-being and dignity differ in a number of respects, according to Velleman. Most fundamentally, as we've already seen, the value of a person's good is conditional, or what he calls interest-dependent, whereas the value of her dignity is unconditional, or interest-independent. What is more, a person's opinions about what's good for him carry special weight. People often are the best judges of what is good for them. By contrast, Velleman claims that a person's dignity is a value on which his opinion, quote, carries no more weight than anyone else's. As he writes on page 612, respect for a person does not require deferring to his judgments about his dignity in the way that it sometimes requires deferring to his judgments about his good. It is not paternalistic to challenge a person's judgment about her dignity, as it often is with respect to people's judgments about their own good. Why is that? Well, as Velleman writes, quote, his value as a person inheres in him among other persons. It's a value that he possesses by virtue of being one of us, and the value of being one of us is not his alone to assess or defend, end quote. When Kant writes of the unconditional value of human beings in virtue of being rational, he often speaks of a rational humanity in your person. The thought is that rational humanity is something that we all share and of which any individual person only partakes. According to Velleman, our dignity as persons, finally, is not just something we passively possess. Rather, it makes active demands on us. It is a value that we must live up to or do justice to. Indeed, he writes on page 612, if a person possesses no value that he must live up to or do justice to, then his life becomes a mere instrument to be used or discarded according to whether it serves his interest. All right, so let's briefly summarize what we've learned so far. We learned that Velleman holds a Kantian view of human well-being. According to this Kantian view, the value of human well-being is merely conditional and derivative of the unconditional value or dignity that persons have as rational beings. Now, Velleman's key argumentative move in what follows will now be this. He will appeal to this evaluative priority of dignity over well-being to argue that a moral permission to commit suicide for the sake of one's own good gets things backwards. we can identify two distinct arguments against the permissibility of suicide in Velleman's text. Let's look at them in turn. The proponents of assisted suicide, whom Velleman is attacking, make the following rough argument. It should be permissible to commit suicide merely to avoid being in pain, because avoiding pain is good for me, and it matters that I get what is good for me. Velleman's first objection to this argument is that it is self-undermining. Let's reconstruct his argument by breaking it down into premise-conclusion form. So, the argument's first premise we've already discussed. It goes like this. What is good for a person, for instance not being in pain, does not have interest-independent or unconditional value. Rather, it matters only if the person matters, and matters unconditionally, that is, only if the person has interest-independent value. This first claim is followed by a second premise. In committing suicide merely to avoid being in pain, I am exchanging my person for that which matters merely conditionally, namely the avoidance of pain. Thirdly, Velleman claims, to exchange my person for that which matters only conditionally is to imply that my person itself has only conditional value. But, and this is the fourth premise, if my person itself has only conditional value, then it does not matter that I get what is good for me, for example, pain relief. We get that from the first premise. So the upshot is that the case for suicide merely to avoid being in pain is self-undermining. Defending a moral permission to commit suicide by appeal to the value of a person's good is internally incoherent, Velleman thinks, because the argument must presuppose something, namely that persons have unconditional value, which is in fact incompatible with the argument's own conclusion. Only if you matter unconditionally does it matter what is good for you, including not being in pain. But by permitting you to exchange your very person for pain relief, we'd in effect be denying that you matter unconditionally. So we'd be pulling the rug out from under our own feet, Velleman thinks. Now, it's important to understand that Velleman isn't claiming that ending one's life to escape pain is necessarily self-defeating from the point of view of doing what's best for yourself. Velleman doesn't deny that it can be in your interest to kill yourself in order to escape from pain, just as it isn't necessarily against your interest to sell yourself into temporary slavery in exchange for money. As he writes on page 614, such behaviors may not damage the agent's interests at all, if the agents are right about the costs and benefits involved. Rather, Velleman thinks, the case for suicide for mere pain relief is what we might call morally self-undermining, because it is premised on a disregard for the value of the agent herself. In discarding your life for your own good, you would be treating your personhood as if it were, quote, a mere instrument to be used or discarded according to whether it serves your interest. In other words, you would be treating your personhood as if it didn't have unconditional interest-independent value, but rather mattered only instrumentally or in an interest-dependent manner. But if that were really so, we'd lose all basis for caring about your good, Velleman thinks. So that's Velleman's first objection against suicide for pain relief. Now, this first argument was essentially defensive. It aimed to show that the arguments for the permissibility of suicide from pain relief are bad arguments because they're self-undermining. Velleman's second objection, we might say, goes on the offensive. It makes a substantive case for the conclusion that suicide for pain relief is morally wrong. Here's how that argument runs, broken down, again, into premise-conclusion form. First premise. In committing suicide merely to avoid being in pain, I am exchanging my person against that which matters merely conditionally, namely not being in pain. Second premise: to exchange my person for that which has merely conditional value is to imply that my person has only conditional value. However, 3, to imply that my person has merely conditional value is to denigrate the value of personhood and fail to respect it. 'Tis to treat my personhood as having not dignity, but merely a price. In an especially telling passage, Velleman compares committing suicide for mere pain relief to selling oneself into slavery for monetary gain. This too is an affront to one's dignity, Velleman thinks, because it treats something of unconditional value, namely one's rational agency, as something of merely conditional value by trading it in for mere material gain. Fourth premise: we ought to respect the value of personhood and refrain from denigrating it. Hence, the argument concludes, we ought not to commit suicide merely in order to avoid being in pain. All right, so much for my reconstruction of Velleman's two arguments. I should hasten to add, for the benefit of those of you who wrote your second papers on this topic, that this is only one possible way of reconstructing Velleman's main argument in his paper, and there may be other equally plausible ways of breaking down his argument. All right, I think it's time for a second thinking exercise. So we've seen that Velleman mounts a vigorous attack on suicide when it is performed for certain reasons, mere pain relief, which he thinks are incompatible with respecting our dignity as rational agents. My question to you is this, and please feel free to consult your texts in answering it. Does this mean that Velleman opposes suicide under all circumstances? Or could there be justifications for suicide that are not covered by Velleman's objections? Why don't you take a few minutes to ponder this question? I'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome back. The answer to our question is no. Velleman does not oppose suicide under all circumstances. While he believes that it's immoral to take one's own life merely to make it go better by avoiding future suffering, he explicitly allows that sometimes the value of a person's dignity can itself justify that person in ending her life. As he puts it on page 617, one is sometimes permitted, even obligated, to destroy objects of dignity if they would otherwise deteriorate in ways that would offend against that value. The moral obligation to bury or burn a corpse, for example, is an obligation not to let it become an affront to what it once was. End quote. So Velleman is here suggesting that dignity can require not only the preservation of what possesses it, but also the destruction of what is losing it, if the loss would be irretrievable. He believes that killing oneself can be an appropriate way of protecting one's dignity in the face of what he calls unbearable pain. Now, unbearable pain is a semi-technical term for Velleman. It's not just pain that is intensely unpleasant or uncomfortable. Rather, it's the kind of pain that is literally an assault on your rational personhood. Not to bear pain, Velleman writes, is somehow to fall apart in the face of it, to disintegrate as a person. To find pain unbearable is to find it thus destructive, not just of one's well-being, but of oneself. Someone who is in unbearable pain is no longer a rational agent, but is reduced to the status of a pain-fleeing animal, as Velleman puts it. To prevent oneself from suffering this fate, Velleman thinks it is permissible, perhaps even morally incumbent on oneself, to take one's life. The very value that makes suicide morally wrong in most cases, namely one's dignity as a rational being, may be best protected by taking one's own life in the face of unbearable pain that threatens one's status as a rational agent. All right, so we've looked in some detail at Velleman's objections to suicide. Now it's time to evaluate how strong the case is that he makes. So let us ask, are Velleman's objections to suicide sound? Now, there are many ways in which one might try to push back against Velleman's two arguments, but I want to focus on a key premise that is common to both of Velleman's arguments, namely the following claim. In committing suicide merely to avoid being in pain, I am exchanging my person against that which matters merely conditionally, namely not being in pain. Let's stump the exchange claim. Should we accept it? In the final part of this lecture, I want to consider with you two quite different ways in which one might push back against this exchange claim. The first objection is due to Francis Cam. In making his exchange claim, Cam asks, isn't Velleman running together two quite different ideas? Namely, on the one hand, exchanging one's person in exchange for pain relief, and on the other hand, exchanging one's continued existence in exchange for pain relief. Now, once we've clearly distinguished between these two possibilities, is it clear that what is going on in a case of a suicide for pain relief is really the former rather than the latter? Is it really one's person rather than one's continued existence that is being exchanged for pain relief? Is any choice where I refuse to prolong my life, and as a result I'm spared from a period of future suffering, one where I trade in my person? Wouldn't the same have to be said then about refusing, say, life-sustaining treatment at the end of one's life, which even Velleman acknowledges would be a morally permissible choice to make? So, suppose that this initial challenge of Cam's is on the mark. What would follow for Velleman's argument? Well, if it is in fact only one's continued existence, not one's person, that is being exchanged for pain relief in assisted suicide or suicide, then even by the logic of Velleman's position, making this exchange need not challenge the unconditional value of one's personhood. For in disposing of herself in order to avoid pain, the person need not be taken to subordinate herself, but only her continued existence to her end of escaping pain. Hence, what would be suggested by the exchange is not that one's person lacks unconditional value, but only that one's continued existence lacks unconditional value. However, it is the unconditional value of the person, not the unconditional value of the person's continuing to exist, which supports the thought that the person's well-being matters. It is because you matter unconditionally, not because your continued existence matters unconditionally, that your well-being and your being free of pain matters. So, contra Velleman, the argument for assisted suicide is not self-undermining, if Cam is right. Likewise, Velleman's second objection to assisted suicide would also fail. We could agree with Velleman that to trade in one's personhood for something of merely conditional value would indeed be to denigrate one's personhood. But again, if Cam is right, that is not what actually happens in assisted suicide. What is being traded in is not your personhood, but only your continued survival. And it's quite consistent to maintain that while the person matters unconditionally, her continued existence does not. There are circumstances such as extreme pain and suffering under which one's continued survival would not be valuable. In sum, if Cam is right, then Velleman's objection against committing suicide to escape from serious future suffering misses its mark. Doing so does not denigrate the value of one's rational personhood. So here's a little thinking exercise that I would like you to do in preparation for your precepts next week. Cam's objection to Velleman clearly turns on her distinction between trading in one's person and trading one's continued existence in exchange for pain relief. Does this distinction make sense to you? Or is it a distinction without a difference? I want to close today's lecture by considering a second possible objection to Velleman's arguments. This objection draws on some ideas of the University of Michigan philosopher Sarah Buss. Following Kant, Velleman identifies one's dignity as a person with one's capacity for rational agency. But is this conception of dignity the only game in town? Well, in her article, The Value of Humanity, published in the Journal of Philosophy in 2012, Sarah Buss proposes an alternative view. According to Buss, our capacity for sentience is evaluatively on a par with our capacity for rational agency. So, on Buss's view, our dignity as persons is grounded not just in our capacity for rational agency, but also in our capacity to feel things. For example, Buss argues that our capacity for sentience is as much a necessary condition for our ability to appreciate the value in valuable things, and thereby to respond to reasons, as is our capacity for rational agency. Now, of course, that's the merest thumbnail sketch of Buss's position, and many details remain to be filled in. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that her alternative conception of the sources of our value as persons is on the right track. Well, this would then suggest a different way of thinking of the exchange one makes when one commits suicide for the sake of avoiding pain. It would be a mistake to think of suicide for pain relief as involving the exchange of something of unconditional value, namely personhood, for something of merely derivative or conditional value, the avoidance of pain. Instead, one should think of suicide for pain relief as sacrificing one thing of unconditional value, namely what we might call personhood as rational agency, in the service of another thing of unconditional value, namely personhood as sentience. So on this way of looking at the problem, someone faced with the prospect of a life filled with pain is confronted with a conflict internal to the value of personhood itself, not a conflict between her personhood on the one hand and her good on the other. Again, here are a few questions to consider ahead of next week. What do you make of this proposal? If it's plausible, how would you fill in the details? If it's not plausible, why is it implausible? How would you resist it if you were David Velleman? I look forward to taking up these and other questions with you at our town hall next week. Until then.